We do have contract training right now, but we do have a KV Core marketplace training that's going on today at 1 o'clock. So if you guys haven't signed up for that yet, don't forget to sign up for that. We have a Nokomis branch lunch coming this Friday.
Hey, Freddie.
Yes.
Just in case some people are on here who don't know what KV Core is, can you give them a quick summary?
Absolutely. So KV Core is a CRM. I hope everyone knows what a CRM is, but if you don't, it stands for Client Relationship Management Platform, where you can automate your points of contacts. You can manage your transactions through here. You can send out email blasts. It's a way to get your database and automate your database, if that makes any sense. So KV Core is one of the favorite platforms out there by agents nationwide, and we do get a discount through KV Core. It is only available to Florida and Georgia agents. So yes, we're special. No, the reason for that is because KV Core had an agreement with Palmer House Properties, and that we get a discounted rate through Palmer House Properties. It's typically I've heard
$500 a month.
$500 a month or $450 a month, and we're getting it for $45 a month. So anyone that wishes to use the KV Core CRM, please reach out to Agent Services and they will get you set up. Please remember, this is only available to Florida and Georgia agents, okay? Because it comes under the Palmer House contract. Do not reach out to KV Core and say, hey, I want to sign up for the $45 a month, because they're going to say, we don't know what you're talking about. That's not offered. But they do. You have to go in through the Palmer House platform. So just reach out to Agent Services if you want more information about that. And join the training today. So you'll see what it does.
Okay. Without much further ado, we're going to get this kicked off or something like that.
Oh, wait. So I didn't finish. So branch lunch Friday, 11:30. We're getting hooked. We're meeting up, and we should start eating by 12 over at the Salty Dog in Venice Beach. So please come join us. And the next Thursday, I've already got it planned out for a Tampa branch lunch. And I'll be sending out information on that. We'll be having Mexican food, and it'll be next Thursday. I believe that's the 30th at 11:30 a.m. And I'll send you guys all the details on that as well. All right. Go ahead, Jeremy. It's all yours. Enough of the announcements.
All right. Thank you, Freddie. All right. Michelle Massengill said she actually wanted to present the vacation addendum because she uses it all the time.
Oh, cool.
No, what I was saying is I do use it all the time, but it's always a pain.
Why is that?
Well, because other agents aren't using it. They don't know what it is, and it confuses the buyers. Typically, they're like, well, wait, does this force me to use the property management company they're using? I mean, it has created fear for the buyers when I've used it, to the point that I'm almost tempted to just quit using it, because nobody's using it up here in the Panhandle.
Isn't it great when we get to show everybody else what needs to get done? I mean, at the end of the day, Michelle, it's a disclosure stating that the seller is supposed to provide some financial information and some other information in regards to the purchase. So wouldn't you want your buyer to be educated on how it works and what he'll be getting?
Well, yeah, I mean, we usually always provide the contract from the property management company, as well as all of the earnings from the last couple of years as
Correct.
part of, before they even sign. So then when I add this disclosure to it, it just confuses people. That's all. Like I said, I just not sure that it's really necessary anymore.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
And we have an attorney here that can actually pitch in, right, Scott?
Yeah, Scott, what? Well, I mean, maybe we should talk about it first before we go into the specifics. Yeah, anyway, so this property, so this is the DD seasonal and vacation rentals after closing. The property is or may be subject to seasonal or short-term vacation rentals for occupancy. A, the seller may or may not, after the effective date, so after everything's signed, right? And prior to closing, enter into new or renewal seasonal or vacation rental occupancy agreements at the market rate and terms for occupancy of this property by third parties after closing. Okay? So what does that mean?
What does that mean?
So I say may not, unless they're gonna pay the seller to continue to manage the property. It will always be may not, unless, and then other people though will put in there that you have to honor all reservations through the summer or through a certain date with that management company that they're currently with. So that's where it starts to get confusing around here.
Mhm.
Because a lot of folks are putting in their property management contracts here that you will honor all reservations through August 30th. And so at that point, the seller can continue to, well, the seller can only continue to take reservations up until the closing. So it's always may not.
Oh, let's keep reading.
Okay. So if the box for May, so may continue to rent after the effective date prior to closing, right, up until closing, right? So if the box for May above is checked, the seller may do so only with the buyer. So there's two different options, right? Only with the buyer's prior approval for the rental terms and conditions in writing, or the second box option is without buyer's prior approval for rental terms and conditions.
Does that bring any clarity?
Well,
So basically what it's saying is, listen, remember, contracts are always a negotiation and an agreement between buyer and seller, right?
okay.
So this is an agreement between buyer and seller that the seller either can continue to rent out the property. And if the buyer is actually looking for a seasonal vacation rental and looking for the income, I would not stop any future rentals unless he doesn't agree to the terms of the rental. Maybe it's not being rented for enough money and it's not covering his costs as a new buyer. There's so many different scenarios, Michelle.
Yeah.
And the idea of this is, hey, the seller's got to disclose whatever he's got, and you got to provide all the financials and show, hey, this is being rented for this amount of time. This is how much it is. And this is how much we got to pay the property management company. And at the end of the day, if the seller says, hey, no, I'm not going to stop, then the buyer has an option to either get out of the contract or not. Is that correct, Scott?
Yes, that's correct. And that's exactly what that's saying up there, may or may not. So basically, if it's may, then basically if the buyer approves it, then they go forward. If the buyer doesn't approve it, they can't go forward. That's the end. It's
right.
Cut and dried.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, this is basically saying, hey, I'm just beating a dead horse. I'm repeating it over and over again, but it's an agreement. The buyer says, hey, I don't want you to rent it out anymore. Maybe he doesn't want it as a vacational rental and he's going to live there, or he's going to stay there for a few months. Who knows? But if it is already under contracts for rentals and stuff like that through a property management company, then that's something he may have to consider, the buyer. Hey, do I want to move forward? Do I not want to move forward?
So what would happen in that case is that agreement between the rental company or the management company, that would need to be reviewed by the buyer to see if they can comply with that or not. So then really now what you're doing is you're reviewing two different contracts, and then there's got to be an out some type in that contract if the property is to be sold. So that would be the provision that I would want a reviewer to look at to see if I was the buyer, to see if I could handle that.
So let me tell you the way I'm handling it, and please let me know if you think there's a better way to handle it. I tell, whether I'm the seller or the buyer, I tell the buyer agents that during their due diligence, they need to contact their property management company and go over the contracts that I've already provided them and make sure that everything is how they want to move forward. Because so that this doesn't come up later in the deal. I mean, I've never had an issue so far, and I put the buyer directly in contact with the property management company because sometimes they don't want to use them. Now they want to. So many people want to self-finance.
Yep. So, I mean, basically what you're saying is the listing agent is or the seller is kind of forcing the buyer to use that property management company and accept those leases that are in place.
Right.
This is saying, no, I don't have to do that.
Yeah. So if I say may not, then they don't have to, right? If I say may, then they have to.
Well, we're not to that part yet. This is just, can they continue, right? They might already have bookings in the future.
And most do.
Right? But this is saying, okay, we go under contract, just this top portion, right? We go under contract and, maybe it's a finance deal. I'm the seller. I'm like, hey, I don't want to lose any income just in case this buyer can't perform and can't close. I want to keep trying to rent the property. So I want to select that I can, right? And then the question becomes, okay, can I do it moving forward after the effective date with the buyer's approval of the terms and conditions and pricing and everything like that? Or can I just move forward without the buyer's approval?
So you have to have a meeting of the minds between the buyer and the seller.
Yeah.
Okay, let's continue reading here. So, because obviously Scott and Michelle and Freddie know this addendum, and but we haven't gotten to all the parts of it yet. We're just saying, hey, property went under contract. The effective date is today. Going forward, now if I'm the seller, can I still make bookings, or can my property management company still make bookings going forward? Right, for short-term rental. So seller shall, now we're the bottom of paragraph A, seller shall at or prior to closing provide buyer with a copy of all the new and renewal occupancy agreements for occupancy of the property after closing, which are entered into by the seller after the effective date. Okay, that's just kind of, summing up the paragraph in my opinion. Anybody, any questions about that, paragraph A?
It's basically saying the buyer needs to review any future contracts, leases, rentals, property management agreements, all that stuff, which it's an educated purchase, right? The buyer should know what he's buying and what he's getting into. So disclose.
Okay. Part B, if the property has seasonal occupancy agreements in place, which were procured pursuant to the terms of the property management agreement, the seller shall provide to the buyer a copy of the property management agreement within 5 days after the effective date. So all parties signed, that's the effective date, right? So they have up to 5 days after the effective date to provide, if they're using a property management company, to provide the property management agreement, right? It's not just the terms of the short-term rental, it's also the terms of, the management company. Are they taking 20%? Are they taking 25%? Are they taking 10%?
And what do they do for that percentage? And
Yeah, exactly.
Are you happy with those services?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if the terms of any agreement provided by the seller pursuant to the terms hereof are not acceptable to the buyer shall have 5 days after receipt of the said agreement to terminate this contract in accordance with the terms of paragraph 6B. We'll go back to that in a minute. Unless this contract is terminated by the buyer, the buyer shall be subject to the terms of the property management agreement for the duration of the occupancy agreement in place at the time of closing. This provision shall survive closing. Okay, so it means if after, right, you receive, so it kind of goes like this, right? I'm the buyer, I received the property management agreement with the leases, I'm looking it all over going, oh man, for the next 3 months, this is a dog. I'm going to lose $2,000 a month with my mortgage and HOA fee and everything like that. I don't want to accept these terms, you know, because that's right. Full disclosure, that's educating them. Maybe that's why the person wants to sell it, because the property management company or just the property in general, it's not performing as an investment property. So they want out of it. So they have up to 5 days after they receive the property management agreement. So it's not 10 days total, right? So if the property management agreement comes 2 days after the effective date, then they still have 5 days to review and get back and say, hey, this is okay, or it's not with the property agreement, the property management agreement.
It's the buyer's due diligence period. It's the same thing as when you receive condo docs or HOA docs, and the buyer is reviewing those docs. They have a certain amount of days to review, and that is their due diligence period.
Got anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm good with that.
Hey, do you want to play that video, Jeremy?
Yeah, sure.
So I was doing some research on this, and I found a video. It was actually done by an agent with another brokerage. So skip that, don't worry about it. But the content is great. He gave a great explanation. So I stole his material from YouTube, and we're going to throw it up here because it actually talks about all the different post-occupancy terms on a contract and the differences between them. So it is great video. Unfortunately, he doesn't work for HomeSmart, but maybe we can try to recruit him. I got Anthony here. Maybe we can start calling him up.
Let's do it, Anthony. Come on.
He did a great video on here, and I would love to share it with you guys.
Strong.
Hi, I'm Walter Morgan with Remax Signature in Daytona Beach. In this video, we're going to discuss the new addendum to the Far Park contract, Rider DD, for seasonal and vacation rentals after the closing. When helping a buyer with a contract that has an occupancy after the closing date, you'll need to make sure that you're using the correct contract rider and referencing the correct sections of the Far Park contract. For the purposes of today's video, there are 3 types of occupancies after closing. There is a post-closing occupancy by the seller. There is a long-term lease with tenants. And lastly, there's a seasonal or vacation rentals that are less than 7 months. But I want to make sure that you're familiar with the 4 parts of the Far Park contract that reference occupancy after closing before we dive into the new rider, DD, for seasonal and vacation rentals. I'll review the 4 parts of the contract that reference occupancy, possession, lease information, prorations, and additional addendas. Section 6B, occupancy and possession of the Far Park contract, is probably one of the most important parts of the contract for you to know when there will be an occupancy after the closing date. Standard D is for lease information, and this will define what information the seller is required to provide to the buyer prior to the closing. Standard K will discuss the prorations and how the rental funds will be handled at closing between the buyer and the seller. And last but not least, Section 19 for addendas. This section will identify the additional contract riders that have been added to the Far Park contract. Let's take a moment to look at Section 6B for occupancy and possession. If there is an occupancy after the closing or the intention of a future occupancy after the closing, the facts and terms shall be disclosed in writing by the seller to the buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered within 5 days of the effective date. A listing agent tip is get all of this information prepared before the listing goes live and is active in the MLS. Now the buyer will have 5 days after receiving the documents from the seller to review, and in the buyer's sole discretion may cancel the contract if the documents are not acceptable to the buyer. Buyer's agent tip: this is a critical time frame for you to watch. The next part obligates the seller to provide an estoppel or seller's affidavit pursuant to Standard D. The estoppel or seller's affidavit are to define the terms and conditions of the occupancies or leases. The next part references if the seller is occupying the property after closing, and the seller must do rider U, which is for post-closing occupancy by the seller. If the occupancy is a seasonal or vacation rental under 7 months, you'll need to use rider DD for seasonal and vacation rentals. As you can see in section 6B has a lot of moving parts. My recommendation is that you take time to read and get familiar with this section of the contract. If you have any question, please reach out to one of your office managers. Standard D starts off by saying that the seller has at least 10 days prior to closing will need to furnish to the buyer estoppel letters from the tenants or occupants specifying the nature, duration of the occupancy, the rental rates, advanced rents, and security deposits. The purpose is to show that they're both in agreement of the terms and conditions of the lease or occupancy. Many listing agents fail to inform the seller of this obligation, which could result in a breach of the contract on the seller's part. So please make sure to read and understand Section D of the FARBAR contract and make sure your sellers know what their obligations are if there is an occupancy after closing. It continues to say if the seller is unable to obtain estoppel letters from the tenants, the same information shall be furnished in the seller's affidavit. Well, a seller's affidavit is basically a written statement from the seller providing the same information that was required in the estoppel letter. If the seller chooses to use a seller affidavit instead of the estoppel letter, the buyer has the right to contact the occupants to confirm the information on the seller's affidavit is true. If the information provided to the buyer differs materially from what was initially provided by the seller, the buyer may deliver written notice of cancellation within 5 days of receipt of the information, but no later than 5 days prior to closing. It's important to take note of these timeframes when dealing with occupancies of more than 6 months. However, the estoppel letter and the seller's affidavit are not required on seasonal or vacation rentals. Say that again. Neither the estoppel or the seller's affidavit are required on seasonal rentals less than 6 months. However, the obligation of the seller to provide the terms and conditions of the occupancy is still required. So it's really important that you're still familiar with section or standard D of the contract. Next, we're going to take a quick look at standard K, which deals with prorations. Standard K defines all the prorations, but for today's purposes, we're going to focus on the ones that pertain to rental and occupancies. Key thing to know is that the prorations are made as of the day prior to the closing date, or the date of occupancy if the occupancy occurred before the closing date. Advanced rents, security deposits, if any, will be credited to the buyer at closing. So take note that the advanced rents, security deposits will be credited to the buyer at closing and show on the closing statement. It's critical to have this discussion with your buyer and your seller in advance to ensure that they're on the same page and they know what's happening on the closing statement. Section 19, addendas. We won't spend much time here, but it is important to note. This section is to identify the additional addendas or riders that are being added to the contract. There are 2 riders related to occupancy. Rider U is for post-closing occupancy by the seller, and Rider DD is the new rider, seasonal and vacation rentals. When either of these riders are attached to the contract, they should be checked off in section 19 to identify that these riders are attached. This rider is designed for properties with occupancy after closing. After closing is the key part there, and they're less than 7 months. There may or may not be a written lease. In many cases, there will only be online booking reservations from sites like Airbnb, Vacation Rentals, or VRBO.com. First, we're going to take a look at Section A of this rider. The question you need to answer is, will the seller have the right to enter into new or to renew occupancy agreements after the closing date? You're going to have to check yes or no. There's no right answer here. This will depend on the buyer's intended use of the property after closing and what the seller is willing to do. If a buyer is purchasing a property for a rental then it's probably fine that the seller continued to book reservations on the property at the market rates. However, if the buyer is intending to use the property for themselves, they may not want the seller to continue to book reservations. As you can probably imagine, it's not every seller is going to be okay to stop booking reservations until they're confident that the property is going to close. So this will be a major point of negotiation and should be discussed with each party as early as possible. The next part of Section A is the seller is allowed to enter into a new occupancy agreements. Will the buyer have to approve the terms and conditions? It's kind of a big deal. This will depend and will be an important part of the negotiation process. If the seller is allowed to enter into new agreements, the seller is required to provide the terms and conditions to the buyer prior to the closing. That pretty much sums up Section A of this rider, but I recommend that you take time to read it and understand it so that you'll know how to explain to either your buyers or sellers when you're working with it. A key thing to know about short-term bookings and reservations is that typically either party has the right to cancel with 60 days notice. So make sure that you, your buyer, and the seller understand the cancellation policy. It's also important to understand that online booking companies typically hold these deposits and other fees that are collected. So it's very important for your buyer and your seller to understand how this works and who's holding the funds. The next section of Rider DD is Section B. This section pertains to the properties that are under contract with a rental management company. Why is this important? Well, because the management agreement may dictate how things are handled between the buyer and seller, or between the owner and the tenants or occupants. Common things to look for in a management agreement. Can the management agreement be assigned? And if so, are there any fees to do so? When and how will the owner get paid? Some companies pay a month afterwards. Some people pay 2 months afterwards. It's important for you to know and understand this, along with what fees are deducted before the owner is paid and what the management company is authorized to do related to repairs and bookings. You'll also want to know who owns the bookings or reservations. In many cases, the rental company will have the right to replace the guest into another rental unit that they manage. The buyer shouldn't make assumptions. They need to review and understand the management agreement. You will see that in Section B of Rider DD, the seller is required to provide the buyer a copy of the management agreement. So if you're the listing agent, I would get a copy of this management agreement before the property is actively listed in the MLS. I also recommend speaking with the rental manager so that you have a better understanding of what's going on. In Section B, you'll see that it says, if the seasonal or vacation occupancies are pursuant to a management agreement, the seller shall provide a copy of the management agreement within 5 days of the effective date. Listing agents, this is an important deadline for you to remember. Within 5 days of the effective date, you must provide this information. If any of the terms of the management agreement are not acceptable to the buyer will have 5 days after the receipt to provide written notice of cancellation in accordance with the terms set forth in Section 6B of the contract. This is a very important timeline for the buyer and the buyer's agent to know and understand. To summarize working with properties that are seasonal or vacation rentals, it's important to understand Section 6B, Standard D, and the new rider DD. When working with the buyer, you should know if the buyer wants the seller to continue.
Any questions about that?
Michelle,
No,
did that help? Did that help with any of your concerns or questions, Michelle?
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, so you're going to find yourself that we're going to have to educate some agents out there. And that's all good because together we're better and they understand what needs to get done. But most importantly, if you're on the buyer side or the seller side, you should be educating your buyer and or seller on how it works and how it should work.
Yeah, I always load those documents in the MLS prior to it going live, so.
Yep. Yeah, the problem is that other agents don't do it and aren't even aware of it. Like you said, mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you're having trouble in the panhandle with the listing agents. Yeah, I hear that often. So just keep plugging along, keep fighting along. At the end of the day, you are doing the service that you're supposed to be doing for your buyer. And if the listing agent doesn't like it, well, then too bad for the listing agent, right?
Right.
All right, moving on to the PACE addendum. Figure out the PACE or something. Yeah, fair.
Hey, Jeremy, before you jump into that, do you mind if I just add something, guys? Unfortunately, since we're talking about these investment properties.
Yeah, Shane, but try to adjust your mic or something. I can barely hear you.
I'm sorry, man. I'm like a Florida bar conference. I'll try to adjust my mic. I'll get back on.
That's a lot better.
Is that better? Okay. I just wanted to point out, like, since we're talking about these investment properties, and we're talking about income from rental and all that. Just so everybody knows, whoever doesn't know, when we're doing a mortgage for an investment property like this, we certainly can count their leases, their rental incomes, up to about 75% is usually the maximum. But we can use that as income towards their debt to income ratio to get them qualified for money. And one last pitch, we have X and portfolio loans for purchasing investment property. That's all I wanted to say. But we can use that income, the rental income, for the fund.
Freddie, you're muted. I can see
In
your
other
lips.
words, for the DTI, right, Shane? They can use, the buyer can actually use the income from the property as DTI.
Exactly. And that's the key, right? Because if they already have a primary residence or whatever, we need to open up that DTI to get them into an investment property. And yeah, we can use that history to qualify. Thanks, Fred.
Scott, you had something?
Not on this. I'm really excited about the PACE loans.
Oh, we'll let you get started.
Let's do this. All right. All right. Scott, you want to take this?
No, I want to hear you and then I'll jump in.
All right. Property assessed clean energy PACE. Programs provide financing to property owners for improvements to their real property for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and wind resistance, and there's a lot of ands there, replacement of the debt through annual property tax bill assessment on the property, and the Florida statute section 163.08 parentheses 14. Good to know. Hey, Juan Rodriguez is coming. And that states that the seller shall give the buyer written disclosure statement in the form set forth below at or before the time the buyer executes a contract to the purchase property to purchase property for which a non-ad valorem assessment has been levied under the section and has unpaid balance due. Keep going, or you want to jump in, Scott?
Okay, I can jump in because this is it's very convoluted. It's really easy to get a PACE loan. It takes about an hour, and it's to get this loan. And basically, it's based on the tax payment and the equity in the home itself. So the reason that you need to basically disclose to your buyers the seller is responsible to do this is because it is paid on the tax roll. And traditionally, what happens is, if they don't understand that this lien is always in first position, it's always going to be in first position, even if you get a new mortgage, which sometimes has issues to do with the new lender. They don't kind of understand how the PACE loan works, that it is paid on your taxes. So in other words, if you disclose it and the taxes are paid in arrears like they are in Florida, it means that the PACE loan payment has not been paid. So which means that the buyer will have to pay the entire mortgage payment for that year on the tax roll. And so that would need to be prorated once again on the settlement statement. So you need to disclose to them that yes, they're assuming this loan Also, what you have to qualify to assume this loan if you're the new buyer, because it stays with the land, to be honest with you. And if you do not qualify for that, then the loan is going to have to be paid off by the seller at the time. So each time you transfer a property, the seller would need to get an estoppel letter from the PACE folks to find out what the actual payment is on there, because there's a qualifying qualifier for the new buyer on that.
Hey, Scott, can you like kind of explain what is PACE? What is a PACE program? I mean, I know it says it there in the first paragraph, but can you maybe take a little further?
Sure.
What exactly a PACE loan is?
Sure. If you want to have solar panels put on your home and you would like to get financing from the government to do so, you know, the government does offer financing for this. That's basically what this is for energy efficiency or any type of thing like that, like solar panels to heat your water heater, solar panels to heat your pool. That's what a PACE loan is for. Clean energy.
All right, let me take a little further. So I have an explanation here of what a property assessed clean energy PACE is. PACE is a long-term fixed rate source of financing that allows homeowners to do energy conservation and hurricane hardening improvements to the property. Property owners can use the PACE financing to cover 100% of the cost involved in installing eligible projects, including all related equipment, materials, and labor. Eligible improvements include energy efficiency, water conservation, renewable energy generation, and resiliency upgrades. A few examples include air conditioners, roofs, windows, doors, water heaters, solar panels, pool heaters, hurricane shutters, and generators. There are two types of PACE programs: residential PACE, sometimes referred to as an RPACE, and there is, which covers residential properties from 1 to 4 family homes, and commercial PACE, sometimes referred to as a CPACE, which covers multifamily 5 or plus family homes, retail, hotels, industrial, and other types of commercial properties. Some states have enabled both types of PACE, while others have just enabled the CPACE. Here in Florida, we do offer the residential PACE. Property owners may pay back the financing for PACE improvements through a special non-ad valorem assessment that is added to their property tax bill each year. So in other words, they're getting financing, and the way they pay back the financing for the PACE is through their taxes. It's kind of like a CDD, right? Similar to a CDD, Scott, is that right?
Yes, exactly. So I have seen actual loans where folks have gotten a new roof for this, and the tie downs were really important on that. And that's what one of the improvements were. Other than that, I haven't seen too much other than a roof or some type of solar panels for the PACE loans themselves.
I know, Jeremy, I think you did the PACE loan once, or so you were talking about that with me about that. You want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's not much to tell. Is working on a property in Holiday, not working on, I mean, you know, helping a buyer purchase property in Holiday, and this came up, and I was like, what's going on with this? You know, and I was confused at first, and I'm like, hey, is this going to be, because it doesn't say if it's going to be satisfied or not. And they said, oh yeah, they're gonna pay it off at closing. And I'm like, okay, so why? You know, I was just like, why? So I guess if it's not going to be paid off at closing, you know, that, I mean, either way, it seems like it needs to be disclosed. But you know, I was like, wait, do I need to do anything? You know, I was really confused with it. So in this case, you know, because the lender, it was a FHA buyer, and the funds were so tight and everything like that, the mortgage lender did require the satisfaction of the PACE financing prior to closing.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me keep reading a little bit further here on PACE. So property owners pay back the financing for PACE improvements through a special non-ad valorem assessment that is added to the property tax bill each year. So this doesn't get attached to the person or their credit. This actually gets attached to the property itself. So if the property transfers ownership, guess what? That is going to transfer ownership as well, right? The new buyer is now responsible for those payments. So very important to know. But property owners repay the special assessment for the agreed upon term, usually the useful life of the improvements, and the interest rates are fixed. There are no adjustments to interest rates and no balloon payments. PACE assessments can be prepaid at any time, and our PACE does not have any prepayment fees. Because the assessment is attached to the property rather than the owner of the property. If the property owner sells the property before the assessment is paid off, the balance of the assessment remains with the property. So the assessment can transfer to the new owner without any need to approve the purchaser of the property. Any questions on PACE?
Just keeping it on pace. All right. Well, that wraps that up. Any questions or things anybody want to share, ask, open forum kind of thing? Unless there's more questions on this or the short-term vacation rental.
No.
I have a quick question. It's Michelle.
Hey, Michelle.
And I'm sure I'll get chastised for this, but let me look it up right now because I want to be clear about what last week, the Florida Realtor, you know, how they send out their little news thing every couple days.
The newsletter.
And, yeah, they sent out right now I can't find it. They sent out one regarding the putting the appraisal contingency in the contracts, the new contracts. And I know we went over this extensively, but I felt like this article really went against it was the way I was reading it is that you should have this in every single contract. And I have not been doing that. And I wanted to know what you guys' opinion on it was, and I should probably just take it offline because
No, I think this is good for everyone to hear.
I was going to call the legal hotline on it because I talked to a couple other realtors about it and they were thrown by it as well.
Okay, so
what
is
exactly
the
is the
actual
question?
Yeah, I was going to say this. So what is the question?
Yeah, that's why I've got to find it. Talk about something else
so
for a second. Let me find
Is
it.
the question, do we need to have the appraisal contingency addendum with all our as-is contract for sales and purchases?
Is that the question, Michelle?
Yes.
Okay. So my viewpoint is, it's whatever is agreeable to the buyer and the seller, right? A lot of folks, a lot of sellers are saying, okay, we got multiple offers, If you want to be competitive, you got to come in with no appraisal contingency.
Okay, let me add to that, Jeremy. Let me step in real quick. Maybe it'll help clear it up real quick. Okay. At the end of the day, the buyer's financing is probably contingent on appraisal anyway, right? So the appraisal. Go ahead.
Yeah. So okay. I found the article. It's called "Buyers Waiving Appraisals. Tread Carefully," and I was under the assumption that with an as-is contract, if we come in below the appraisal value or below, if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer can walk if they want to, or pay the difference, or the seller can come down. This article says that is not the case.
Well,
This article says, it says based on that the legal hotline says we do not understand the financing paragraph that it actually should that you're actually buyers waive appraisal contingency also assumes that buyers have the authority to waive the appraisal. Do you want me to forward this to you? Because it came out on June 1st.
Yeah, I think the article is talking about if you waive the appraisal, can you actually waive the appraisal?
I don't know.
I'm still curious. I'm still confused as to the question. So,
well, it seems like it's because it's a lender requirement, right? Can the buyer really agree to waive the appraisal if it's a lender requirement?
well, the lender's going to do the appraisal no matter what, even if it's waived. So they're going to do the appraisal, and then the buyer's got to make a decision whether they're going to come out of pocket to meet that gap or not. That's what that is about, the appraisal contingency gap is about. As far as them getting out of the contract if it doesn't appraise, absolutely, because their financing is contingent upon appraisal anyway. So if there's no appraisal gap in there and the property does not appraise, either the seller can come down to meet the appraisal price, the buyer can come up to meet the appraisal price, or the buyer submits a financing decline letter and says, hey, this property's not going to work, it doesn't appraise, and we're out.
Or there could be a meeting of the minds and they can meet in the middle.
Correct.
Right.
Well, that's what
Or
I'm
they can
saying. Either the
right.
seller comes down, buyer comes up, they meet in the middle, or last case scenario, buyer's financing is contingent upon appraisal. So if he doesn't have that gap, or he or she, they can back out of the contract because with a decline letter for financing. Is
Right.
that correct, Shane?
And Freddie, I think where their confusion is the new contract has made a change in the, I guess, in the section for appraisal where there was a
Yeah, well,
section
what
before.
it says is before appraisals was the last thing that more lenders would do. Because number one, it's an additional cost to the buyer. And they want to make sure that the buyer is actually qualified for a loan before they start putting them through the rings of fire and start charging them money for things. So appraisal used to be last thing ordered. Now they're saying that the appraisal has to be done, completed, and the buyer has to have it before the financing period is over. Before I would hear, oh, the only thing left is the financing period, but their financing period, the appraisal. But my financing period is over in 2 days and we haven't done appraisal yet. Guess what? You need to get an extension for your financing period.
Right.
Okay. And what they did was they changed it in the contract to say, hey, your appraisal needs to be completed and reviewed before your financing period is over. Otherwise, that appraisal is, you're not going to get, if you get a loan denial because of it after your financing period, your escrow's at jeopardy.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, and I think, basically like right now the article is up. What the article is talking about, as I read it, was that if the buyer adds, we're waiving the appraisal contingency, whether or not they really can or cannot waive it. That's a whole different discussion versus if I just bring in an as-is contract with no other, no appraisal contingency, any add-ons, just straight as is, and the appraisal comes in short, can my buyer walk out? And I think where the confusion was on the old version of the contract, it was super clear. It says if the appraisal came in short, the buyer can walk out. On the new contract, it's a little more confusing, but it still has, like you're saying, Freddie, it has the financing contingency as a way to walk out.
Correct.
And
So they're saying that you can't use the appraisal to walk out, but there's always a way around that one. And the way around that is your financing is contingent upon appraisal. So if you can't get financing, guess what?
right. And again, that is where the new version of the contract just made it a little muddier, where before it was real clear. I
Right.
think that's where the confusion lies. Because I know that with the current contract, at least from my experience, yes, if the appraisal comes in short, you can negotiate, or your buyers can decide to walk out or make up or whatever.
But the only way they
difference.
could walk is with a decline letter for their financing. Let me
Correct.
make that clear one. The
Yes.
only way the buyers can't walk away and said, hey, the appraisal didn't come in, I'm not paying for it. They have to have a decline letter from the lender. Okay?
Yes, that is 100% right, because, and that's where I had to make sure I had an experience with a buyer that had sufficient assets to cover the appraisal gap. And I had to explain to them that-
and a couple of months mortgage payments in their bank,
Right.
right? They have to
Yeah.
have a couple of months of bank statements held back. So,
yeah, the specifics were he had over 100,000 in cash in the bank, and the appraisal came in, I think it was like $5,000 short. It was almost nothing, and he wanted to walk out. And I explained to him the financing, you need to get a cancellation from your financing.
correct.
The
And let me clear
lender,
that up too. And Shane, correct me if I'm wrong. the decline letter is not for the buyer, it's actually for the actual transaction, for the property. Right? So we're getting a decline letter. We're not saying that the buyer's declined, we're saying that the property is declined because it doesn't meet the financing requirements.
Yep, that's correct. That should be easy for the lender to put out.
So the buyer can still go and buy another property. He's still approved for a loan. It's just that property is not approved for a loan because it doesn't meet the appraisal. Does that make
Right.
sense to everybody?
Well, the question was asked before from me to the lender, and the lender told me, look, as soon as I give the denial letter, he can walk, which was,
Correct.
it's only $5,000 difference. He has $100,000 in the bank, cash, liquid. Does that mean he has to continue with this contract? And the lender said, no, when I give him a denial letter, he can walk, even though he has the capacity to do it. This particular property did not meet the lending requirements.
Correct. And it's a buyer's choice. At the end of the day, he doesn't have to put money out of his pocket. So it's a lender requirement, and that's the way for the buyer to get out, is to be getting a loan denial. And it's a loan denial for that property, not for the buyer. The buyer can still go out and buy something else.
Right.
Just so you guys know, too, loan denials, broadly speaking, they're not something that's reported to credit agencies. It's not something.
Come a little closer, Shane. We can't hear you.
So he's saying that the.
I apologize.
Go ahead.
The loan denial letters are not something that's reportable. It's not something that goes to the credit bureaus. They're specifically dedicated to the transaction. So, you know, I don't want anybody to get spooked about, you know, what happens if your client gets denied for a loan. There's a multitude of reasons. Obviously, like this case, the appraisal value didn't come back, so we can't do the collateral underwriting, so we would do it like that. But for a multitude of reasons, but I just want everybody to know that, like, you know, in a transaction like this, a loan denial, it's not going to adversely affect the buyer at the end of the day.
Okay.
So we have a question in here from VJ. Just out of curiosity, what is the interest rate that PACE charges? That's a great question, which I don't know. You'd have to contact PACE and see what their programs do. I'm sure that interest rate changes, like everybody else's interest rates change.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be specific to today's market, VJ. I would reach out to them and see what they're offering right now on that. What they did say is it cannot change during the term of the loan. So it's not adjustable. It's a fixed rate for the term of the loan with no prepayment penalties. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
When I just Googled PACE interest rates, it said between 6 and 8%.
There you go.
I'm sure it could change, but it's over the period of 15 to 20 years.
And that's a lot lower than a credit card, right? Throwing an AC on a credit card or something like that. Yeah, I would look into it.
And then below that, it says Discover card.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
Anybody else? This brings us to the top of the hour.
Nope.
Cool. Thanks for everybody for hanging out with us this morning. Don't forget, we'll see you Friday at Nokomis and next Thursday in Tampa. Actually, today, 1 o'clock, don't forget, we have KV Core training, all right,
Yeah.
for Georgia and Florida agents, 1 o'clock on Zoom.
Any new agents who hasn't not attended the orientation, it's happening today between 2 and 4. Okay, it'll be the same link. So if you're interested in that, you know, please reach out. I did see someone on here that I haven't reached out to yet. Oh, George. I remember George. Who was on here? Sorry.
Yeah, so Jeremy, why don't you, Jeremy does in-person and Zoom or orientations every Wednesday. I do in-person orientation, he does them in Orlando and I do them in Tampa and Nokomis, but they're by appointment only. So if you guys want to do an in-person orientation, let us know, reach out to us, and we will meet you at one of the offices. Or you could jump on Jeremy's Zoom on Wednesdays, what is it, 1 o'clock?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
All right. Sounds
All
good.
right. Well, it's 11 o'clock.
Yep.
Happy hump day, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. Make it productive. Put your goals and thoughts into action. All right. Because they're just thoughts and goals if you don't. So put them into action. Get going. Let's move it. We're halfway through the year. I want to see a kick-ass end of the year. So let's rock the boat. All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Freddie.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye, Scott. Bye, Shane.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Scott.